From finance to media to philanthropy, Michael Bloomberg has revolutionized our economy. He's transformed how we consume information. He's changed us. He's challenged us as well to solve the toughest challenges, from gun violence to climate change. Michael, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for his full service.
As a three-term mayor of New York City, he transformed schools, transportation, public health, and more. As a philanthropist, his contributions on everything from gun safety to climate change remind us of our responsibility to our communities, our country, and the world.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Last month, U.S. President Joe Biden bestowed the Medal of Freedom on Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire media mogul, politician, and philanthropist who is arguably the most influential anti-vaping advocate in the world. Since 2005, Bloomberg has invested over $1.65 billion into a global crusade against tobacco use, with hundreds of millions dedicated specifically to anti-vaping campaigns. His impact on tobacco control is legendary, but it is most pronounced at the World Health Organization. Joining us today to discuss Bloomberg's influence on the WHO is veteran reporter Marc Gunther. Gunther has written about politics, government, media, and business for nearly 50 years. He was an editor-at-large at The Guardian newspaper and a senior writer at Fortune magazine. In 2015, he turned to write for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and you can find his current work on his Medium channel, The Great Vape Debate. Marc, thanks for coming back on RegWatch. It's really good to have you back.
It's good to be back, Brent, and I commend you for reading about Michael Bloomberg being awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Biden, and keeping a straight face while doing so.
Well, let me ask you right off the bat, what did you think about that?
I didn't know about it, to be honest. I missed that news. But Michael Bloomberg, in some ways, has been an exemplary philanthropist. He has given away huge amounts of money. He's done some great things in the world of public health. And he's actually been pretty good on the anti-cigarette smoking side. He's also enabled large numbers of students, I don't know how many, to attend Johns Hopkins University, his alma mater, at no charge with free tuition. But he is not an advocate for freedom, particularly in this arena of alternative nicotine products. He is essentially the opponent of freedom. There are millions of Americans who would like access to alternative, safer nicotine products like e-cigarettes, like snus, nicotine pouches, and Bloomberg Philanthropies and an array of nonprofits that he funds, not just in the US, but around the world, have been by far the leading opponents of making these safer, life-saving products available. And without focusing entirely on Bloomberg, for this half hour, I think it's a significant taint on what otherwise would be a very admirable legacy as a businessman, great entrepreneur, mayor of New York, did quite a good job by many accounts, but this is really a stain on his reputation.
Let me ask you, I know that you were just at the e-cig summit in Washington, D.C. What kind of developments happened there?
Well, a few things happened in and around the e-cig summit. One was that an organization that used to be called the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which has a new leader in Cliff Douglas, who I know you've interviewed, rebranded itself as, I have to look it up, Global Action to End Smoking. Cliff Douglas has spent his entire adult life fighting the tobacco companies over the issue of cigarette smoking, going back to the late 70s, I believe, maybe the early 80s, if not. And he also went to great lengths, and I could debate this decision that he made, but he went to great lengths to try and separate himself from the industry, promising to take no money from not only tobacco companies, but again, e-cigarette or alternative nicotine delivery system companies. And even so, he has continued to be ostracized and denigrated by the Bloomberg funded groups. And this emerged as a point of conversation at the e-cig summit. He was also barred. I don't know the details on this. I didn't have a chance to talk to him, but the most important group of tobacco researchers in the world is the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, and they did not permit Cliff even to attend their latest meeting in Edinburgh some months ago. And this is a very both troubling and interesting development. Troubling in the sense it's never a good thing for people to close their ears and eyes to diverse viewpoints, no matter where they come from. But interesting in the sense that I see the attacks on someone like Cliff and his organization, and there are other examples I could bring up where tobacco scientists have been attacked. I see it as somewhat of a sign of, if not desperation, a recognition that the prohibitionist forces can't win this argument on the basis of evidence or science. And so they are resorting to ad hominem attacks and continuing to spread what I would have to call, I don't know, I guess I would call it mis or disinformation, but certainly the shoddiest of science to try to make their point.
The public-facing comments from these organizations are at sometimes, astounding.
They really are. And I'll just give you one other development that came out in the last day or two. There was a group report put out actually on an organization funded by what was formerly the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World on tobacco products in Japan. And what they learned, this is very public information, it's been reported by the tobacco companies, is that cigarette sales in Japan in the last decade have fallen by an astonishing 52%. That has saved thousands of lives. And the reason, we can't be 100% sure because there's lots of factors that go into it, but what almost surely is the primary reason, if not the only reason, is the rise in popularity of products known as heat not burn tobacco products. They really should come up with a better name. They're branded as IQOS by Philip Morris International, which makes them. But as we've seen the smoking rates fall, we've seen the sales rates for these alternative products rise. And it's a classic and beautiful example of how if you give people choices, they have the freedom, there's that word again, to move off cigarettes and the ability, because nicotine is an addictive substance, they'll move to other delivery mechanisms, in this case, this heat not burn product, to get their nicotine fix so they can maintain that. By the way, another quick thought on nicotine, a lot's going in my head because I've been in the tobacco space now for the last 48 hours. Nicotine also has some benefits. That's one reason people use it in a variety of forms. It shouldn't be demonized as a bad drug. Not that there are any bad drugs particularly, but my point is, what a story in Japan. The freedom of people to switch to another product has enabled them to leave cigarette smoking, their free will to do so, save their lives, hopefully, be of benefit to their children, grandchildren, whatever. And this is exactly what Bloomberg and his allies and the World Health Organization, which I know we're going to talk about, are campaigning against in the US, but even more worrisome in countries that don't have their own infrastructures and scientific savvy to analyze this and are getting guidance from the WHO that essentially is successfully discouraging them from offering these alternative products. It's really a frightening thing, Brent. It really is I've written about a lot of stories. I've been a reporter for almost 50 years, but this is really one of the most troubling stories I've ever covered.
Let me ask you, Marc, before we dive in depth into the WHO, because you just finished a 2-part series that you released on Medium on your channel, The Great Vape Debate. Before we get there, just give me a snapshot of what your assessment is of vaping tobacco harm reduction in the United States. We last had you on in September 2022, a couple of years, later coming up. Has it changed for the better or for the worse?
There's a difference between what's happening in Washington, where I live, and what's happening on the ground around the country. If, in fact, a centralized top-down bureaucracy based here in Washington called the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA could impose its will on the American people, we'd be in a terrible place. They have essentially denied permission for millions of vaping products to be allowed into the marketplace. They've approved only 23 out of many, many, literally millions of applications in a very flawed process. There never should have had to be a million applications for every product and every flavor, but that's a story for another day. But they essentially have denied the American public, or would like to deny the American public, access to the e-cigarette products that people want. Fortunately, centralized bureaucracy here in DC can't tell the rest of us what to do effectively, or at least this particular one can't. So what we are living with is a vast market of illegal vaping products that are widely available. FDA has tried to enforce the fact that some of them are illegal. They just can't contend with it. They're coming into the country from China in large numbers. It's just a perfect, it's almost like prohibition in the 1930s. People still were drinking despite the fact that prohibition outlawed alcohol. And the FDA's attempt to prohibit all flavored vapes has had no more success or efficacy than prohibition did in the 1930s. They're available. Now, it's not a good situation because these are totally unregulated products. We don't know the chemistry. We don't know if they're well made. It's at least hypothetical that some could be contaminated or that the devices could be poorly manufactured. I certainly haven't heard, thank goodness, of any cases of that. So on the ground, things are okay, not good, because the other thing that the FDA's action has done is it's shut down, I don't know how many, I believe close to 50% of the independent vape shops in the country. People did not want to risk their livelihoods by ignoring the law in these cases. And those were a beautiful example of innovation and bottom-up change in society, because the owners of these vape shops were the people who helped adult smokers move away from combustible cigarettes, which are lethal, to vapes, which are not 100% safe. We don't know. They haven't been around long enough to know, but they're, by all credible accounts, dramatically safer than smoking combustible cigarettes.
I often wish that more people would talk about the destruction of all those businesses. An entire industry was created. How many times do you get an opportunity to see in life brand new industries flourish, come up from nowhere, independent business people owning these stores and doing good in their community, and a regulator has come along and destroyed their businesses?
Yeah, it's, as I said a moment ago, this is just one of the reasons why this story is so troubling. And you're quite right, Brent. None of us have paid enough attention to what has happened to those vape shop owners. I've met a few of them at these conferences, and they are local folks who, most of them former smokers themselves, who took up e-cigarettes and found that it helped them and decided to open a vape shop and try and share the product that they enjoyed and benefited from with their communities. Thanks, FDA. Let's be totally fair here, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about FDA in the last few days, and many of the people there are idealistic regulators. Many of them go there because they do believe in the public health, and they have been given mandates by Congress, which passed the Tobacco Control Act and laid down a lot of the specifics that they have to follow. So if we're going to blame someone for the lack of access to flavored vapes and the shutdown of the vape shops. It has to really be a combination of the Bloomberg prohibition machine, the nonprofits he's funding, Congress, Democrats in Congress in particular, for reasons that escape me, have been very anti-vaping, and then the regulators at the FDA as well. So there's plenty of blame to go around.
Marc, you've just released a stellar two-part series on Medium, the first titled, What's Wrong with the WHO? The World Health Organization is spreading misinformation about e-cigarettes to the detriment of millions of people who could use them to quit smoking. And the second part is titled, Why is the WHO so wrong about e-cigarettes? Michael Bloomberg and his philanthropy are a malevolent influence on the World Health Organization, critics say. What is the World Health Organization's stance on vaping in your mind, and do you have any examples?
Well, it's not in my mind because it's all over their website. It's on their Twitter account. They have both spread unwarranted fear about the risks of e-cigarettes, and they discourage people from using e-cigarettes as a way of quitting smoking, even though there's really strong independent evidence that for many, many people, e-cigarettes have become the best way to quit smoking. It's also in a new bot, an AI-generated bot that you can go to online and ask questions. And the stance, and it's also in their policies, their advice, most importantly, to poor and middle-income countries around the world, where essentially they've given these countries the advice that they should entirely ban e-cigarettes. And they awarded to a health minister of India, which enacted a ban on e-cigarettes, their sort of highest award for leadership. So there's no ambiguity about their position on e-cigarettes. They're steadfastly opposed to it. And that's obviously a big problem because, as we've discussed, e-cigarettes are a very useful way for people to quit smoking combustible cigarettes. Respected organizations all around the world, including in countries like the US, which has largely been hostile to e-cigarettes, acknowledge that they are a safer way to consume nicotine than smoking. So fundamentally, the advice they give to other countries, they're terrible on e-cigarettes. Then in their public communications, they have consistently spread fear and minimized the benefits of e-cigarettes. And if you like, I can give you one example, an egregious example from their Twitter account.
Yes, absolutely. I believe that you actually had that in your piece on Medium, and it was all to do about seizures.
Correct. So this is a tweet from the WHO that says vaping increases your risk of seizures, typically within 24 hours of doing it. This comes from a study which was anecdotal. In other words, it's not a trial, not really using the most scientific methods, of about 100, I believe it was 112, maybe 116 people who suffered seizures and were also vapors in the United States. So it's based on reports from people, self-reporting. We don't know 100% whether they actually had a seizure or not. And after the study came out, others analyzed it, including notably a professor from the University of California at San Francisco Medical School, Neil Benowitz. And he essentially said, this study is so flawed that it should not discourage anyone from taking up vaping. It does not in any way establish a cause and effect between e-cigarettes and seizures. And yet here is the WHO, knowing full well that the study has been criticized, if not debunked, using it as a way to tell people, don't let vaping harm your health. And again, Let's just be clear here. I don't think, and I don't think any reputable scientists think vaping is a good idea for young people. There are some issues around nicotine in the developing brain. Of course, in the US, vaping and cigarettes can't be bought by anyone under 21. So we are dealing with that in a legal way. And the other thing is, it's not probably a great idea for someone who just wants to vape for the heck of it and has never been a smoker. We don't really know over the next 20, 30 years whether the vapes may have some health effects. But if you are a smoker, there is nothing that you can do that's better for your health than to stop smoking. And if you find you cannot just quit on your own, turning to an e-cigarette to help you quit, to maintain your nicotine intake, is one of the best things you can do for your health. Here is the World Health Organization discouraging people from doing that.
Do you think it might have been better for those on this side of the argument if we'd been saying from day one, if you not that if you can't quit, you should switch to vaping, is that if you don't want to stop consuming nicotine, because that's ultimately the decision. You stay smoking because you want to continue to use nicotine. So if you are unable or unwilling to give up on your nicotine addiction, then you should absolutely switch to a safer nicotine product.
Yeah, and I think it also should be not merely can't quit, but maybe you don't want to quit. Nicotine is an interesting chemical. I'm not an expert on it, but there are people who say that it, with the exception of its effect on adolescent brain development, it can be beneficial. It helps some people concentrate. It helps some people relax. If you look at the people who are smokers in the US, many of them come from groups that are under pressure in some way, or so-called marginalized groups, Native Americans, LGBTQ people, lower income Americans. They're clearly getting some benefit out of smoking and or vaping. And nicotine, some people argue, I'm not an expert, is no more addictive, neither harmful than caffeine. And we are not running around telling people to stop using caffeine. We're certainly not telling people to stop drinking alcohol. There's no reason to seek, as groups like the Truth Initiative do, I call them the so-called Truth Initiative or the Half-Truth Initiative, because they too are not purveyors of good information. But they say their goal is to sort of demolish all youth use of nicotine. Or maybe even just to end nicotine entirely. And I don't understand that. There's no scientific basis for it.
Well, you mentioned those that are still smoking today, but let's not discount that the last couple hundred years of Western civilization has been, advanced by people who are smoking. I mean, how much literature, how many words from journalists have been written with a cigarette in the mouth over the last 150 years? I mean, we put men on the moon, we discovered great breakthroughs in science. I mean, all of this stuff, and vast majority of people were smoking at that same time. So if there was, if this was detrimental, that wouldn't have been the case.
I'm not quite sure I'd go that far, but it's certainly true that a lot of great writers and, political figures and, Roosevelt had actors. Roosevelt had that famous cigarette holder. So yeah, it's certainly not the end of American society as we know it if people smoke. The problem is we didn't really learn until the mid-60s that there were long-term dangers to this. And that's why in the world that you and I live in, which I assume is, largely middle, upper income, well-educated people, you don't see a lot of people smoking anymore. It's become kind of an invisible addiction, but that doesn't mean that there aren't millions of Americans. I think it's 8 million around the world, 450,000 a year in the United States, who are dying or also suffering disease. But the 450,000 is people dying prematurely from smoking. So in a sense, the invention of the e-cigarette or the heat not burn product, or the snus, or the Zyn product. These are all innovations that enable people who want to get nicotine to obtain it in a much safer way. And instead of banning them or demonizing them, we should be thanking them because they have they're providing people with an opportunity to save their own lives.
You know, Mark, we hear a lot about trying to prevent another generation of young people from becoming addicted to nicotine. But those same people, politicians, public health activists, and so forth, they never say that we need to prevent another generation of young people from becoming addicted to heroin, or
Right.
becoming addicted to alcohol, or becoming addicted to cannabis. And all of those are way higher in usage amongst young people in the US than nicotine is, and we never hear a word about it.
Yeah, I mean, you do hear something. I mean, no one is. I mean, there's an anti-drug messaging out there, certainly for young people, whether it works or not. But I think your point is really well taken, which is there are risks. Well, first of all, the smoking rates among young people and the vaping rates among young people are way down. Smoking has just been dropping continuously for, I think, 15 years. Vaping peaked maybe 2018, if I'm getting my numbers right, when Juul was very popular. It's way down since then. So not only is it not particularly worth worrying about because it's not going to kill these young people as opposed to getting in a car after drinking alcohol. It's less dangerous than, I think, premature sexual activity, their mental health and bullying issues. And you say cannabis, I mean, I certainly believe we all should have the legal right to consume cannabis, but the data seems to suggest that about 10% of people who use cannabis do become addicted to it. The natural health physician, Dr. Andrew Weil, who also happens to be a experienced and prolific user of a variety of drugs, including psychedelics, once said, "There's no such thing as good or bad drugs. There are only good or bad relationships with drugs." And I think that's the way we should think about it. It's not a ranking of this is a good drug, that's a bad drug. It's a question of how you use them. And people who do become addictive we should help. But we certainly shouldn't prevent adult smokers from having access to safe nicotine products to protect children. It's really not fair to the adults.
And that's certainly what appears that the World Health Organization is doing. They've made the decision for adults themselves. And, just to show quickly two more examples that you provided in your writing, and this one here is the truth. These harmful products contain nicotine and toxic substances that can have harmful effects and long-term consequences. That seems, fairly reasonable, but, the messaging is a lot more prohibitionist than middle of the road.
Well, there's a line in there. They are not safer alternatives to cigarettes. See that? Yes, they are. I mean, yes, they are. And even the FDA, which is over-regulating, the CDC, which has spread scares on e-cigarettes, the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine in the United States, the UK Health Authority, I could go on and on. They all have said very plain language that vaping and heated tobacco are, in fact, safer alternatives to cigarettes. In this sense, who is the worst of the worst? They're out of step with all of the government health agencies.
It is indeed the scientific consensus that e-cigarettes are less harmful than smoking, but yet the WHO appears to not be adhering to science.
It's really shocking. And something, if I could get my ideas before the people in the US Congress or in the British Parliament, which are the two major funders, I believe, of the World Health Organization, their job should be to go to the WHO and say, why are you not listening to the US, UK, not to mention EU, New Zealand has been very good on this. Why are you not listening to the science? There's a lot of debate about vaping, obviously, how to regulate it. But on this point, that e-cigarettes are safer than combustible cigarettes, there is scientific consensus, and there are only a few cranks out there, just like you can find people on any subject. Does the moon revolve around the earth? You can find dissenters, but there is a stronger consensus even than on climate, I think, that this is true.
So is the WHO then listening to another influencer? Could that be Michael Bloomberg?
I mean, they're not listening to me and they're listening to Michael Bloomberg. Why would they do that?
He is the global ambassador for non-communicable diseases at the WHO. Does that mean anything?
I don't know that it means anything. It's quite an honor. It's an office, I guess, in the office of the director of the WHO. I don't think he's literally traveling around, fighting non-communicable diseases. But again, he's done some good things. He's, traffic safety, just to pick another example, as a real cause of death in these many poor countries, because the roads and the cars and the engineering of big cities, if you've ever been to a place like Mumbai, leaves something to be desired. And so he's worked on a lot of issues that are prematurely killing people in poor and middle income countries. But yeah, he has a lot of influence there. He has donated not only to their programs, which other foundations have done, but he has donated to some of their quote unquote scientific work, to their policy development. And again, they would tell you, they didn't respond to my inquiries, neither did Bloomberg Philanthropies, but I'm quite sure they would tell you his money doesn't steer their policy. But it's really hard to come up with any other reason why they would be so out of step with, again, the consensus science, even in a country like the US, which I would argue has been hostile to e-cigarettes from a regulatory standpoint.
Mark, I have here the WHO's report on the global tobacco epidemic from 2023. So this is their most recent global report. And you go down to page 2, essentially, after the blank page. And there it is, made possible by funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies. I don't know. Is there, at least they're being transparent, is there anything wrong with this?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I would object to it if I didn't see, I can't really call it evidence. If I didn't see, or if I didn't believe, based on just my knowledge of how organizations work, that Bloomberg was having a bad influence on their science, their policy, and their communications. I've written a lot about philanthropy, as you noted, and there is an issue about sort of US philanthropists, not only, here in the US, but then even worse in some ways, traveling around the world and sort of telling people and governments what to do. So I do think the philanthropists, say, who want to work on smoking policy in India, really should make sure that that policy is being carried out in a democratic way, that people's voices are being heard, and that it's not top down. So it's a little tricky, but in this case, because Bloomberg has been so hell-bent on curbing these safer nicotine products in the US, and because they are such a prominent supporter of the WHO, and because the WHO has been consistently not just wrong, in my opinion, but ignoring the scientific evidence around vaping, it's really hard not to conclude that the Bloomberg influence is not what is it, or it's relatively easy, I guess, just to put the positive spin on it. It's relatively easy to come to the conclusion that Bloomberg's influence is pushing the WHO in this unfortunate direction.
Well, let's just use what our opponents are accusing the tobacco harm reduction side with their relationship with big tobacco. If it said funded by PMI, it would have never been released. It would have been completely discredited. So why is it that, their side, Bloomberg, can fund something and it's perfectly fine at the World Health Organization level, But you say you have, the former Foundation for a Smoke-Free World working using PMI dollars independently, funding research, and they are the evil devil. Why is there a discrepancy here?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I think there's you could come up with a pretty good explanation, which is that there was a period of time where the tobacco industry had a demonstrated record of lying to the American public, not being trusted, claiming that cigarettes were not addictive in that famous 1994 congressional hearing. And so the question is, what's the sentence for that industry? What's the statute of limitations for those frankly terrible things that they did?
Sure.
I'm not aware of, I haven't followed it closely for, during all the intervening years, but to me, I think we should listen to everyone at this point, including the tobacco industry, because the cigarette companies, as you know, are also now the manufacturers of the e-cigarette brands that are helping people to quit smoking. The reason why all the e-cigarette brands, or the major ones, are owned by the tobacco industry is a classic example of over-regulation favoring incumbents. The process of getting permission to sell an e-cigarette in the US is so complicated and expensive that only a very well-funded company can even put the application through and get it considered. So that's a creation of the regulatory system, which is, I know, your area of expertise. But my belief is we should listen to everyone. We should evaluate what they say based on its truthfulness, based on the evidence, based on the persuasiveness of the argument. And that's the way you end up with the best decision. I mean, there is a marketplace of ideas, and it makes no sense to exclude from that marketplace not only the tobacco industry, but the e-cigarette industry, to the degree there is an independent one, but also scientists who in any way, in the most peripheral way, can in some way be tainted for having a relationship with those folks. I mean, I've gotten criticized for quote unquote taking tobacco money. And what it was I wrote a couple of stories for a website called Filter that writes about drug policy. They had some grants from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And I think I was paid $500 for the story. I mean, come on. I've been a reporter for 50 years. First of all, there's several layers of separation. And, the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, to its credit, also tried very hard to separate itself from Philip Morris International. Cliff Douglas has now done even better. But the prohibitionists, I think some of them are more interested in destroying the tobacco companies, frankly, than they are in protecting the health of Americans. I really do. They are so worked up into a frenzy about this enemy, and they find it useful as a fundraising device, that they can't accept the idea that big tobacco has been, is, and always will be a force for evil in America. I see people quoted, critics of the foundation, Cliff Douglas's work, saying, well, we'll trust the tobacco companies. Why don't they, if they stop selling cigarettes? I mean, this reveals such an ignorance of the way economics and society and corporate governance work. If the CEO of Philip Morris or Altria tomorrow said, we're going to stop selling cigarettes, his or her board would instantly replace them with someone else, because their job in a society is selling a legal product is to maximize their profits. If they shut the company down entirely somehow and said, we're not going to make another cigarette, I think the number is 13, 14 million smokers in America. Someone else would make those cigarettes. There's demand out there. I mean, just the sheer idiocy sometimes of people saying, why don't they stop cigarettes, as if that could happen or would solve the problem, is just, again, shocking to me. I think far too few people in high school or college ever take an economics course, and they come away having no sense of the contributions that the markets and free enterprise and companies make to our society, including making every one of the nonprofits in the world possible.
I think it's pretty clear, at least on our end, and other guests that we've had on talking about tobacco control in this effort, there seems to be a very prominent kind of anti-capitalism bent to their position, one that's insurmountable.
Yeah, I've reported a lot on nonprofits, and there's a tremendous suspicion in general of capitalism and markets. And I do think that, there are externalities in the world. I do think we need some regulation. I would imagine you, as a regulation expert, would not say that we should completely abolish all regulation. But yeah, there's a tremendous lack of appreciation for the power of markets and trade and capitalism to do enormous good in terms of lifting people out of poverty, creating jobs. I mean, we could go down the list. And yes, I do think, shockingly, since, I certainly don't think Bloomberg is an anti-capitalist. He's a billionaire who made a lot of money by selling terminals to Wall Street. I think in this case, he's someone who thinks he knows better. And I think that's what it comes down to. I think he fundamentally believes that you shouldn't allow these products on because children are going to use them, and then those children's rights trump all the rights of smokers. At least that's the most favorable interpretation I could come up with for it.
Let me ask you this, because do you think it's relevant in a way? One of the biggest complaints about regulatory authorities when they're under the government of a Republican or conservative government, especially in the energy sector and so forth, is what's called regulatory capture. It's when the regulatory agency becomes captured by the industry and makes decisions, favorable to the industry and so forth. How are we not in the same environment? It's just opposite. The people doing the capturing of the regulators are the nonprofit public health groups, the Bloomberg philanthropies, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and so forth. They have, in a way, captured the regulators and are forcing them with their influence to make policy decisions in their favor.
I think that's right. And I think it's actually a little more complicated and even worse than that. There's a concept in economics I'm sure you've heard of called bootlegs and Baptists getting together. The people who liked prohibition were the Baptists, who didn't like drinking, and the bootleggers who made their money by selling illegal liquor. This is a bootlegger and Baptist situation. The Baptists are Bloomberg, and obviously not a real-life Baptist, but Bloomberg and the nonprofits on the one hand. And the bootleggers in this case, ironically, are the tobacco industry, because they couldn't be more thrilled that the most popular, easiest way for people to quit smoking is being kept out of the hands of Americans. You actually see in the analyst reports on companies like Altria and British American Tobacco, the analysts saying, well, we hope that the FDA can crack down on these illegal vapes because they're eating away at the market share of the cigarette companies. So David Sweener, a wonderful Canadian economist and tobacco control person, calls the Bloomberg-funded nonprofits big tobacco's little helpers. They are essentially carrying or doing the work of big tobacco in terms of keeping this disruptive, superior technology out of the market.
Yeah, and that's the case. We did actually have David on a couple months back discussing exactly that and calling out the areas of the, Altria's reports and stuff and the financial analysts making those statements. It's really shocking. But yet, all of that aside, there is still something going on with the regulators. One of the clips I'd like to show you right now is FDA Commissioner Robert Califf in his appearance in early April, I believe, at the Congressional House Oversight Hearing Committee. So let's have a quick listen.
Had the CTP done its job over the last decade, there should have been tobacco harm reduction products approved through the appropriate process.
If I may, tobacco harm reduction product is an industry term. Vaping, if combustible tobacco didn't exist, you'd be horrified by what's in the residue from vaping. When you think about that going into your lungs over the course of decades, it's pretty horrifying.
Congress enshrined harm reduction as a kind of a pillar in the 2009 Tobacco Control Act. Unfortunately, the Center for Tobacco Products' current leadership seems to have abandoned harm reduction as a foundational principle of its tobacco policy by refusing to authorize other tobacco products that have been pending before your agency for years. And if you have 900 cigarettes that have been approved and only a handful of vape or other products, that seems to be divergent. So in addition to vaping, you have other products like Zyn or something similar to that. Would you consider that to be a harm reduction product?
The term harm reduction tends to be used by industry to cover a lot of different areas.
Commissioner, in this hearing, you have said that the term harm reduction is an industry term or a term that industry uses. But to be clear, it's not just industry that uses this term. The Institute of Medicine uses it. And the concept of harm reduction has been embraced in other countries. That is, they accept and communicate that there are options that are less risky than a traditional cigarette. Are we ever going to get to that point in this country? Do you accept this idea?
Definitely accept the idea. Your point is well taken that industry is not the only entity to use it. But what I want to avoid, speaking of harm reduction, we've talked about combustible tobacco kills people. Neither using vaping or combustible tobacco is the healthiest thing you can do. Vaping, compared to none of the above, has residues that are quite concerning for long-term use. I'm just worried that when we use the term harm reduction now, it's often part of a vast advertising campaign that's not taking account of the addiction side.
So according to FDA Commissioner, tobacco harm reduction is a part of a vast industry campaign. Does that make sense?
No, doesn't make sense. I don't think there's been any industry marketing around the idea. Well, I shouldn't say that. I guess PMI, Philip Morris International, which is in the heat not burn business, and Altria both, I guess, use the term harm reduction on their websites. There's certainly been no vast advertising campaign. And again, I think the emphasis of Commissioner Califf there is wrong. That kind of testimony is going to discourage people from moving along what people call the continuum of risk, from the most unsafe product to the safer products. And I hadn't seen the hearing. I should go back and try and watch it. It seems like at least the Congress people whose questions you highlighted there are very much on top of the issue and pushing it in the right direction.
Yeah, that was hopeful, even to me, to see that. They were pushing the right buttons and pressing the right issues. But yeah. FDA was not having any of it. Like, there was no appreciation for tobacco harm reduction at all. It's an industry plot. That's right. What I took from that.
And the term was not invented by industry. I believe it was invented by public health people. It's been used in all kinds of arenas. It's been used with HIV/AIDS in terms of getting people safer needles. Seatbelts are sometimes considered a harm reduction device. Driving a car is a risky behavior. If you put your seatbelts on, you've reduced the risk.
Is it disheartening to hear FDA Commissioner take that position on this issue?
It is. And I guess the one question which we can't get an answer to is this his deep core belief based on his training? I think he's a physician. He should know better. Or is he influenced, or to what degree is he influenced by the Democrats in Congress and the Biden administration to take this position?
So what influence do you think Bloomberg has on that position that the Democrats have, through Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, through Bloomberg News and his wire service and the stories that are covered? They're never at all favorable to vaping. Is Bloomberg's influence in the U.S. as strong as it might be with the WHO?
I think his influence is very strong in the US, but I don't think it's so much, certainly Bloomberg News, I don't think has been any worse or better than any other mainstream news organizations, most of which have performed pretty poorly on this issue, although there have been some notable exceptions, and you've had some of those people on from places like Reason Magazine. But I think his influence is through the nonprofits and through this idea that we touched on a few minutes ago, which is there is a kind of deference, or at least there historically has been, it's diminishing, to the so-called public interest group, to the so-called not so-called, they are nonprofit groups. Many of them, by the way, not in this case, but many of them, generate a lot of income for their staff and live quite well. But the point is, I think there is a deference to the nonprofit sector. There's a belief that all they care about is doing good in the world, and a skepticism again of anything associated with tobacco industry, particularly among Democrats. And Dick Durbin, who's probably the most outspoken anti-vaping guy, his opposition to the tobacco industry goes back again a very, very long time to the era of tobacco CEOs misleading Congress. So I think in general, the Democratic Party, for better or worse, probably for worse, tends to be skeptical of all things corporate and trusting of all things coming out of the nonprofit sector. They have a sense of the world is divided into good guys and bad guys.
Truly Puritans, if you ask me.
Yes.
If you could wave a magic wand, Marc,
Right.
take your reporter cap off and put your magician cap on.
Right.
How would you change what's happening in the U.S. and how would it be for the better?
Oh, I thought you were saying if I could make a magic wand, wave a magic wand, I could keep them out of the hands of children. Because again, this is just a myth. There's a demand when there is a demand for products, I don't care what the product is, those products will be supplied through one channel or another. We've seen that with vapes because the flavored vapes are out there. They're just not out there in the legal channels. If I could wave a magic wand, I would ask FDA to create some sort of broadly applicable product standards to make sure that the chemicals inside the vapes, the mechanics, the electronics of how the vapes work meet certain standards, and then keep a close eye on what's happening out in the world to the products, but get these products out into the marketplace in a fair and safe way. But even more importantly, have honest health communication with the public about the risks. It's not super complicated. You could say to people, this is still a new product. We really don't know for sure what some of the implications might be over the long term. We're not deeply concerned, but you should think about it. But if it's a choice between vaping and smoking, that should be a very easy choice for every smoker to make. That's honest. It's clear, but that's the communication we have seen in some other countries. And New Zealand does a great job. The UK does a good job, but we've heard nothing like that. And you just saw from Dr. Califf fudging around, not an opportunity to deliver an important message missed.
And also missed is the opportunity to have put big tobacco out of business. If 10 years ago, the United States government and public health and tobacco control embraced the independent vaping industry and heralded, really told everybody this is the best thing since sliced bread, then PMI wouldn't be involved. They wouldn't have the march. Neither would BAT or any of the big tobacco companies. Independent vaping would have put big tobacco out of business.
Maybe. Consolidation happens in business, but definitely the cigarette industry would be in deep, deep trouble. Whether PMI and Altria would now own the big vaping companies, we can only speculate. We can watch the legal cannabis industry. It's still very disaggregated, but it wouldn't shock me in 5 or 10 years if there were 3 big cannabis companies. Maybe one of them will be Altria or PMI. But the point is, we could have put a tremendous dent in smoking in the United States and saved lots and lots of people's lives.